I just thought I'd do a video on spiritual gifts, specifically speaking in tongues. Now, as many of you know, as Christians, speaking in tongues can be something that people are either for or against. Now, me personally, I'm for it, and I believe that people can still speak in tongues today in the church, but therefore, if they do, they should have an interpreter present, someone who can interpret it, or they'd be able to interpret it themselves. So, what is tongues? Now, people seem to be very confused by this, and they think maybe it's just gibberish, maybe it's supposed to be known languages or unknown languages. Well, actually, it can seemingly be all three, because in the scriptures it tells you that when people spoke in tongues in the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost, when they spoke, they were preaching the gospel in known languages that people from around the world could understand, because people were visiting at the time from different nations, that place where they were at, and everyone who was passing by, who obviously spoke different languages, they could understand what they were saying in their own languages, which is a miracle in and of itself. So it shows that tongues is real. And I know that from a different perspective, you could say, you've got the tongues which is not literal languages in the world, but Paul might have said it's like the tongues of angels, you could say, or speaking between you and God. Like, basically what that is, it sounds like gibberish to some people, like it's a mixture of different words, but it's to edify yourself in the spirit, it's speaking in the spirit. And all that means is that you might not even understand what you're saying, but God knows what you're saying. Because you have to remember that languages is what we use today, like to communicate as normal human beings with one another. But where God's concerned, he can understand what we're saying in our spirit, or like whatever's going on in our hearts. So we might not even find the words to say, but God knows what we're saying, even if we're not making sense to anybody else. And that type of tongues is just between you and God. You're not supposed to say it to anybody else, because they might understand you and they can't edify the church. Now, the last one, which I mentioned, was the tongues of angels. Now, we don't really know too much about the tongues of angels, because they're up there and we're down here on the earth. So the point is, the tongues of angels could be anything. Like, you don't know, perhaps tongues of angels could sound like human languages, but a mixture of all, or different ones, or words that we don't even have here on earth. But the point is, these things are real. And why do I believe it's so real? Now, I've had experiences where I've spoken in tongues as a new believer. I'll give you one instance. I was in college at the time, and I was just praying in tongues in the hallway, like to myself, like just praying like to God in tongues, because I didn't know what to pray. And no one was in the hallway. I thought I was by myself, so I thought this would be a good time to just pray in tongues in faith. And what happened was, a friend of mine came along in the corridor in the college, and they said, "Oh, I could hear you speaking in Arabic." I was like, "What?" So I don't speak Arabic, but they could hear me, and I was saying something about hurry in Arabic, which I believe is ijal. I don't know, but I don't speak this language. I had to Google it and think, why some of the words I've spoken in tongues, I've Googled them, and they're actual words that people have in different languages. And I'm not joking about it, because I might put up some screenshots of words that I've literally searched on Google that I was speaking in tongues with and interpreted it afterwards. I'll do that at the end of this video. But I was saying that, and I was saying Yuri, I think it was. And that means light of God in Hebrew. So I was somehow telling God to hurry with the light of God. Something to do. I was asking God to hurry somehow. But this is only a little bit of an experience that I've had with tongues, because I was kind of on the fence about it before, and I thought, is it true that people can speak in unknown tongues, and, you know, between them and God, and no one will understand them, or you might not understand what you're saying. But if you've got an interpreter present, or someone from another nation who can speak different languages, or their own language, they might understand what you're saying. Because for all the words you're saying in tongues, there could be actual definitions for words in different languages, if that makes any sense. And they could be forming sentences and things to do with God. And that's what I'll show you at the end of this video when I screenshot what I was saying in tongues, but it all links together for what I was praying in tongues. But I'll read some scriptures for you that show this. So this is from 1 Corinthians 14, and it's talking about the gifts of the Spirit, which is like, you know, seeking after them. It says from verse 1 onwards, "Follow after charity and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that ye may prophesy. For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God. For no man understandeth him, howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries." So it's shown here that no man will understand tongues, if it's an unknown tongue, but you're speaking to God and no one understands him, which is like you won't even understand what you're saying. But in the Spirit you're speaking mysteries. And it says verse 3, "But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification, exhortation, and comfort. He that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifieth himself, but he that prophesieth edifieth the church." So what that means is, if you're prophesying, of course you'd be speaking in your own language and people would understand it and be able to interpret what you've said and it'd come to pass. And then that's like to glorify God. That's to edify the church, that is. But when you're speaking in tongues, it's something between you and God. But if it's to edify the church in tongues, it says later on verse 5, it says, "I would that ye all spoke in tongues, but rather that ye prophesied. For greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh with tongues, except he interpret, that the church may receive edifying." So this shows that if you want to speak in tongues in a public space, like the church, then you must have an interpreter present, or you must be able to interpret it yourself. And thank God, this sounds crazy, but thank God we've got things like Google Translate, or you know, you can get a dictionary and you can actually search up words that you've spoken in tongues, and it will actually show you what you're saying in another language if you're speaking another language. Some of the things can form sentences and be actual words, which is glorifying God, or prayers for specific needs. And I'm not joking about this because I've tried it and it works. It's not a joke. So here's what it says on verse 6. "Now, brethren, if I come unto you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you, except I speak to you either by revelation, or by knowledge, or by prophesying, or by doctrine?" So basically what he's saying here, like, it won't profit them unless he speaks by revelation, knowledge, prophesying, or doctrine. So he's saying, like, with tongues you can't edify the church unless it's interpreted correctly. And not all the gifts of the Spirit people are going to have. Like, tongues is one of them. There's many gifts that people can have of the Spirit of God, but we should seek after the gifts. But he said rather prophesy, because you can edify the church better that way. But tongues was assigned to unbelievers to show them that God is working and that they may believe on Christ. Because that's what happened in the book of Acts. There were people who were preaching in other languages and people who were like, how can they be speaking in our languages? But that's the miracle of God. So we'll scroll down to near the end of this verse, the verses. Let's see. Here's the one from verse 39. "Wherefore, brethren, covet to prophesy, and forbid not to speak with tongues. Let all things be done decently and in order." So of course there's an order to these things in churches are described. It's all in this chapter. You can read it from 1 Corinthians 14 onwards. It tells you all you need to know about the gift of tongues and how it's supposed to be interpreted, and how to use it, and how to use prophesying to edify the church. But then tongues is for unbelievers to see, you know, that God's working and to believe on Christ. But tongues can also be for yourself. But if you're going to use tongues for yourself, pray quietly, or pray in tongues when no one can hear you. Basically, that's how the order of things is. Because if you're praying out loud in tongues, people are going to think, what's going on with this person talking gibberish, or nobody's interpreting it. I don't understand what you're saying here. And then it's not actually helping anyone. But it will help someone if you've got an interpreter present, or if you can even interpret it yourself and tell people what you're saying, even if you use Google. Sounds strange, but thank God we've got Google these days. So I'll show you what I was saying in tongues in this video. So here I was referring to the Creator when I said this word. I said that badi in the tongues. Here I was saying kida, which means bow, like bow to. Here I was saying hila, which means hope in Hebrew. Here I was saying helion, which means to heal, cure, save, or remove anxiety. I said hali, which means grace or favour, which is derived from Hannah in Hebrew. Akin, eyes in Punjabi. Creator, I bow in hope for you to save with grace in your eyes.